Hello everyone, it's GigaBeef here, and today we're going to be looking at one of the Tarkov community's commonly stated facts regarding strength and endurance, which might not actually be true. The basis of this myth is rooted in how skills level, as well as the skill exhaustion mechanic that gives diminishing returns of experience as you gain more points throughout a raid. The issue here is that it's not clear when the diminishing returns actually kick in. A common misconception that you see all over the place is that when leveling endurance or strength at the beginning of a raid, if you want to maximize it, you use an SJ6 stim to increase your stamina and stamina regen. By using it to run out your entire stamina bar in one single unbroken run, you gain more skill points than not doing so. Well, what's the logic here? When you start in a raid in Tarkov, your skills begin with a bonus of 29% extra experience for the first set of points acquired, signified by the plus 129% when you hover over any of the skills at the start. As you perform actions that level up each skill, the bonus goes away, so the experience gained goes from 129% to 100%, and then after even more points it begins to decline lower and lower until it's at 1% or so, and it's practically impossible to gain any more experience. The idea behind the continuous sprint is that the 129% bonus only goes away at the end of the run, so they say. So by using stims and maxing out the distance that you can travel, this should give way more points than going the same distance in several parts, because that way you're allowing the game to update the diminishing returns multiplier to the next lower band in between. Although this is a very common suggestion, there are also plenty of people who refute that this is the case as well, so let's put it to the test. For reference, I have the air filter built but with no filters inside, and at the time of testing 27 endurance and 35 strength. First off, let's look at endurance. Critically, in the current skills model, you can only level either endurance or strength at any one time with movement, which turns out is very useful for doing this kind of testing. When underweight, we only gain endurance points, and when overweight, strength. So by heading into a raid overweight, this means that we can't take any points into endurance until we're ready, and I conducted 4 tests. Firstly, we take an SJ6 stim at max stamina and we run out our full stamina bar. This took our PMC from 85.5 to 94.2 for a total gain of 8.7 experience. Next, we do the same length run, but this time we sprint and walk in between to regain our stamina. This is closest to how we normally behave in raid. Interestingly, this one took us to 93.7 or 8.2, 0.5 points short of the first test. So is there some validity to the original claim? 2 more tests reveal what is going on here. Next, we run the same distance, except we don't walk at all in between and regain our stamina while standing still. This time, we get to the 94.2, exactly the same as with the first test and 8.7 experience gained in total. Finally, walking the entire way took us to 88.8 for only 3.3 experience points. With all of this information, we can now deduce that walking has a different multiplier for gaining skill points than sprinting, but if we don't walk, then over the same distance we get the same total XP, whether we do it in one run or not. This means that the diminishing returns calculation is applying progressively on the sprints that we do for endurance, even if we run and don't stop for a really long time. Now that we've determined how this functions for endurance, let's see if strength works in the same way. Similarly to how we dealt with endurance, this time we come in just underweight so as not to level strength until we need it. It's a bit more awkward this way around, as you need to pick something extra up to get into the strength regime, but grabbing a nearby stash item will do the trick. Repeating the same experiment as before, we start with the SJ6 sprint. Do note, by the way, that tipping through the overweight threshold doesn't seem to make any difference to the length of the sprint, at least around the threshold itself. This is the same as it was when we were just under the weight limit. For this one, we went from 8.4 strength experience to 17.1, gaining 8.7 points in the process. Another interesting thing is that this is the same identical number of points as the endurance test, so these are symmetric as far as we can tell. Then, without using SJ6, we run only, stopping completely to regain stamina, and in that case we get to 8.4 to 17.2, which is 8.8 points. I think there is probably a little bit of rounding somewhere here, because these results are basically the same for all intents and purposes. So what have we learned so far? Critically, it doesn't matter how far you travel in a single sprint, because you can achieve exactly the same amount of experience over multiple sprints when stopping in between to recover your stamina. This means that the original claim of skill points only updating after the end of each sprint is not correct, or at least not at the moment, and the diminishing returns is applying in a consistent manner. However, there is a certain element of, not truth per se, but practical wisdom here in the original claim, which is that in a real raid, players don't stop still in between each sprint, but continue to walk instead. If you aren't using SJ6, you're going to be walking sooner and for longer, as your stamina bar takes longer to fill back up. As the results show, this means that for the same distance, we will in fact get less skill points than the player using SJ6, simply because they can be running for more of that distance than the player without. This is what matters because of the difference in the experience gained for running rather than walking. The other minor takeaway here is that strength and endurance work the same in terms of skill points gained around the overweight threshold, and although we probably could have guessed this, it's good to confirm it. One other element that I wanted to investigate was the point at which the diminishing returns go away. The conventional wisdom, which I also usually go by, is that once you have diminishing returns on a skill, if you wait for 5 minutes without leveling any points into that skill at all, you get a reset back to 100. This allows you to level skills multiple times in a raid without having to extract and come back in again, which is useful earlier in the wipe for things like vitality and sniper skill, as well as for strength and endurance, because like we said, you can only level one at a time, so one is on cooldown while the other is being active. The important thing to note here is that the UI doesn't update back to the no diminishing returns state until you try to actually get some skill points in that skill, so it will still look red even if you're past the time where you can get more XP at the higher rate again. However, this threshold actually seems to be shorter than 5 minutes in certain circumstances. When testing, after 4 minutes I could regain strength skill points again after dipping into the 60% threshold, which was a bit surprising. Investigating this further, rather than checking the percentage on the diminishing returns status in the menu specifically, I went to look at the total points you got for the second sprint after waiting for various times since the first. As you can see, for endurance, and at least for me, there is a hard threshold somewhere between 3 minutes 15 and 3 minutes 30, after which you could regain skill points again. It didn't seem to make any difference how long I waited after this, and the second sprint always gave the same amount of XP, which means that we're snapping back to the 100% skill points regime rather than any kind of gradual recovery of skill XP once we're standing still. This doesn't seem to be the case for all skills though, because when I tested Vitality, after 3 minutes and 15 seconds, my skill points didn't return to 100% in the menu after waiting and then gaining a few more points to check it. Currently, I'm not entirely sure what drives this, and whether it's fixed per skill or scales with level for example, but it's something to bear in mind. So as usual, a big shout out to all my patrons, hit all the buttons if you enjoyed the video, and as always, have fun in your raids.